for me, this was a rather stirring book to read. And even though I've been working with it now for some time, it's still stirring. So, Mark, I want to turn to you then and say there was a phrase or a sentence very early in the book. In fact, it was on page 9 that got my attention right away. And I want to share this statement from you. The statement says, "A yearning for spiritual intelligence is bubbling up like fresh water across the landscape today." Now, when I read that, the question kind of took a twist. And so I want to put this back to you in terms of a question, if you're willing to share your thoughts about it. So here's the question that came up to me when I heard that. So what was the yearning that was bubbling across your inner landscape that brought you to write this book? It's a big book. So what was going on with you? So would you share with us that?
Yeah, well, look, thank you. And maybe just say thank you to you and also Pari Center for hosting this as well. It's always a nice thing when people want to respond and relate to books that you've written. So I do appreciate that. Well, there's a kind of, I suppose there's an imminent answer to your question and then a more expansive one. The more imminent one was that I was involved with a couple of broadly science projects organized by the International Society for Science and Religion that tries to bring scientists and people from the social sciences and then also theologians and philosophers together. And one was on human origins and the other one was on the nature of intelligence, particularly in relation to artificial intelligence, with the broad idea that if artificial intelligence is increasingly shaping our lives, the way to respond to that is not to fear it or try to stop it, but is to think about what our intelligence is and how it is different from and indeed exceeds artificial intelligence, so that we become more conscious of who we are as human beings rather than becoming more and more drawn into the world shaped by artificial intelligence. It's, you know, it's a response of vision rather than attempting to contain these things. Although I've no doubt that, you know, management and ethics and law and so on is important as well. It's almost like, you know, now there's a new prompt amongst all the other prompts to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be spiritual creatures? What does it mean to have this perception of life that could be called spiritual intelligence? And then more broadly, partly in relation to my own psychotherapy practice, very much, of course, in relation to my own questing and journey, I felt this was a chance to ask myself and then try and write it out. Is there a facet of our intelligence that's different, say, from rational intelligence, emotional intelligence, is somehow fundamental and basic, that I might get clearer about, as well as hopefully contribute to other people's asking about these things. So it's quite personal in that way.
Yeah, I can see that. And, you know, thinking about all of the material as well as all the personal delving that you've done, that was a lot to bring together all at once. So I can imagine it was a big learning in your own internal processing. Yeah. Well, when I think about the book, there are two concepts that seem to me so basic that I think if we could talk about those first, that would give some foundation. So obviously spiritual intelligence. So I would like to know what do you mean by spiritual intelligence? But secondly, you bring up a concept that I wasn't aware of before, and maybe this is my naivety, but you talk about spiritual commons. And I hadn't heard that term, spiritual commons. That was a new term to me. So what are they and how do they fit together?
Yeah, so spiritual intelligence, it's easier to start by saying what it's not. So it's not rational intelligence, which approaches life and the world through reason, through logic, through pattern. You know, it's what artificial intelligence uses. although that's all very useful. I think it's not emotional intelligence as well. There have been some people that have written about spiritual intelligence, and they kind of bolt it onto emotional intelligence and say that if emotional intelligence is the ability to understand feelings, to be wise in our personal encounters, not fly off the handle, to understand our feelings, sometimes they add a kind of spiritual addendum to that and say, and this also produces meaning in life or purpose. But I think that spiritual intelligence is something different, really. It's a kind of basis. And one way of putting it is that if rational intelligence and emotional intelligence are kind of know-how, forms of know-how to be in a rational world, to be in an emotional world, I think spiritual intelligence is more like a know that. It's to know that we abide and dwell in, are embraced and can embrace a kind of river or atmosphere of being that's intelligent and can be made intelligible to us, that is really the groundswell and source of our life. And so whilst that then leads to know-how, and informs things like purpose and meaning and shapes our emotional and of course our rational lives as well in metaphysics, spatial intelligence is in touch with everything that comes prior to all that, and know that there is a ground that we can relate to in these other ways. So that's something about, did you want to?
Yeah, so that ground would then be the spiritual commons. Is that right?
Yeah, so this phrase spiritual commons, it might be a bit of an English thing. I don't think there is a phrase spiritual commons that others have used. I mean, there might be, but I haven't come across it. But I borrowed it because in English history or British history, there's this notion of the common lands, the commons, which used to be available to anybody to like drive your sheep on and draw from wells and springs or whatever that existed on the common land. And gradually the commons were enclosed across British history. And now there's very few bits of common land left in the country. And I like the analogy with a kind of spiritual commons, that there is a spiritual land, dwelling place, source, that's freely available to us all, day by day, moment by moment, which spiritual intelligence can know, as you say. But it's kind of been enclosed in the modern world by the ideologies, by the ways of life that sort of forget that it's there. Scientific materialism, insofar as it forgets that it's there. Even consumer ways of life that forget that there's an abundance that underpins our being, rather than a scarcity that we must try and accumulate and possess and so on. So it's drawing on this notion of the common land, talking about a spiritual commons, but it's also a kind of neutral term, because I very much in the book want people to approach this in a felt sense, rather than use the words that the spiritual commons is also given in religious traditions and wisdom traditions and so on. But, it is also that which might be called spirit or God or Tao, fire, emptiness, the myriad words that's used for that sense of wellspring.
But then it's very inclusive. I mean, it's very ecumenical in a sense, because it doesn't separate us by whatever form of philosophy or religion or whatever. I really like that it's the inclusiveness. And also I noticed that you talk about this sense as almost as, I'm making this term up, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you're talking about spiritual democracy as well. It's like it's so available to everyone that we can't really own it, and we can't authorize it. We can't put it in a corral of one kind or another. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, I mean, the metaphor that's quite well known in spiritual traditions, wisdom traditions, is that of the sun. The sun just sheds its light, its warmth, its radiance on everyone, regardless. And I think the spiritual commons is like that. It's there for everybody, regardless.
Would you say then, back to thinking about spiritual intelligence and the commons together, could you say that spiritual intelligence is the capacity to tune into spiritual commons?
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. It's first of all the awareness that there could be such a thing, because of course it's not self-evident to many people in the modern world now. So it's first of all the sense that there could be such a thing, and then the intelligence bit is how to become more familiar with that, to know it more richly, know how to align with it, resonate with it, and give yourself to it, even as it gives itself to you. And so, you know, personally change your life, but also socially, a civilization, a society looks very different when it's organized around the awareness that spiritual intelligence brings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's a fantasy for me at the moment, but it's, in the sense that I don't see where the whole culture is doing that at this point, but it's hopeful, certainly is hopeful. Well, so we've kind of talked about the what, but your 7 steps imply that there's some ways that we might approach it. So can you tell us, just with 7 steps, maybe at least a snapshot of each of them?
No, thank you. Yeah. So my idea was to try and write about, you might say, 7 facets of life, and talk about them in a way that drew attention to the spiritual commons within them that spiritual intelligence can know, and also these projects that I was part of as well, to bring in the insights that came from that about human origins and about intelligence itself. So the first step concerns the big story we tell about ourselves as human beings, and I've been very dismayed actually that these big histories that are very big sellers, telling the story of Homo sapiens emergence on the African savannah 200,000 years ago, our relationship to other Homo species and so on. They're very driven by utilitarian concerns, a kind of struggle to survive and adapt. And I think there's actually good science from evolutionary anthropology and evolutionary biology, and these were the projects that I was privileged enough to observe and contribute to in a small way, to suggest actually that right from the get-go, the thing that distinguished Homo sapiens was that we had become even more adept at participating in the spiritual commons than other Homo species, like Homo neanderthalis or heidelbergensis. There is evidence that these earlier Homo species used ritual, used language, maybe even told myths and so on, to enable them to relate to the intangible world and make it tangible. But it's also clear, I think, from this new research that Homo sapiens developed these abilities to a greater degree, and they wove that presence wove itself into the lives of our early ancestors and continued to develop across the millennia. And so it's truer to say that we were driven by a quest for an awareness, a participation, an exploration of the intangible facets of life, quite as much as the business of foraging and so on the African savannah and then elsewhere afterwards. So I think that there's a different big story that really desperately needs to be told, because if you tell a big story that's all about scarcity and survival, then that very much shapes the imagination now. And it's quite clear that that story is not doing us a service. So that's the first step. I'll be briefer with the other ones. The second step comes from that because it's about our freedom. And if this is true about Homo sapiens, then it means that the heart of our freedom is not freedom of speech or freedom of choice, although those are valuable things, but actually is the freedom to become aligned with this greater life. And I think that we need to think about freedom too, and that starts to look very different in the light of spiritual intelligence. Then the third step is about what's the nature of this spiritual commons. And the core idea there is that it's actually simple, that through all the complexity of life, the way that life feels like it's speeding up, problems are compounding and so on, that there is still a simplicity that runs through all things. It might be called the good, the beautiful, and the true. Again, it's described in different ways, but that's constant and can be aligned with, and that's a guide then through a changing life. And I think that when that basic guidance is lost, that's part of what it feels like for a life to speed up and become more and more complex. The fourth step has to do with how we become more aligned with this. I call it settling the soul, because I think that there's a lot of work now being done on our personal inner lives, either in therapy or in religious contexts. But it can become a bit interminable. Mm-hmm. And I think that in a way, you need to do enough in order to start to get a glimpse of this wider life and be able to become more aligned with that wider life. So therapy, church going, temple going, and so on has this broader goal. Then we come to death, because I think that the great wisdom and spiritual traditions all teach that it's through processes of dying that we really become aligned with this wider life. And that's tough, that's hard, because dying is frightening, and it's about not knowing and having to trust and have the experience of dynamics and forces seize you and take hold of you, which definitely brings about suffering. And yet spiritual intelligence knows that dying is actually a process of natality ultimately. And I think that we need that in the modern world, not least in the years now following the pandemic, where death has been heavily medicalized, often for very good reason. But we need more than just that understanding of death very desperately now. So that's the fifth step. Number 6 is to do with ethics and morality, but particularly virtue. I think that the so-called culture wars of now are very much driven by ethical concerns, in fact. But the trouble with saying that I'm good and my enemy is bad is that it just pits people against each other. And so it's almost like morality is turned in on itself. But virtue, again, the older tradition, says, no, what really matters is who you're becoming, your personal qualities, your characteristics, not just because that affects the way you behave, but because these qualities enable you to resonate more and more with the spiritual commons, which too has qualities like being good, beautiful, and true. And so the virtues are very much part of spiritual intelligence. And then finally, I want to think about time and how we experience time, because I think that, again, rational intelligence very much insists we have a rational understanding of time, chronological time, which is useful. It gets us together in different time zones so we can meet and talk. But nonetheless, there are other kinds of time, and particular kairos time is what I talk about, which is the sort of presence of the moment and how that can release new insights, change, transformation, sometimes quite small, sometimes more dramatic. And so realizing that the spiritual commons comes to us through this different experience of time feels really important. But also because we're going to live in a world where it increasingly seems like there's going to be big changes. And so understanding that breakdowns can lead to breakthroughs is really important as well. And spiritual intelligence can help us understand that.
Wow. That is just huge, just huge. I've already shared this with you, Mark, but I'd say for the group, reading the description of the evolution of the human consciousness that you included had a really interesting effect for me. I felt very resituated after I read that part, and I had to sit and brew on it quite a bit. What was really interesting to me was that much of that is available to us, and I would have seen quite a bit of it in one way or another. There was something about reading it in one chapter so that it was a relatively short period of time to go through the whole history of human mind. It changed my perception of where I fit in that. And that was really rather stark to me, because I couldn't look at myself, I can't now, as a person who looks back maybe 2 or 3 generations. Maybe I can think backwards and feel a part of my great grandparents in some way, or a couple generations out. But that doesn't work anymore. There's something about reading it in that short block of time that caused some reorientation that happened for me right there. But one of the things I want to go back to that comes up in in those early steps, you talk about the importance of the axial stage. And in some places, you talk about the reemergence of the axial person. And that really struck me. That really struck me. So I wonder if you could share some about that with the group here.
Yeah. So I've been very influenced by the work of Owen Barfield, who was one of the Inklings, friends of C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, and also corresponded and had dialogues with David Bohm as well. And Barfield, through his study actually of words, realized that words change meaning over time and so become fossils of consciousness. They can tell us about how people experience life very differently. And so his work fits very well with other individuals who have understood that the human experience of being alive, relating to ourselves, but also to the world around us and to the gods, God, changes very dramatically. And that must be factored in if you're telling any kind of history. And the Axial Age is perhaps the best known of these ways of thinking about human consciousness changing. It's associated with the German philosopher Karl Jaspers. And he noted that about the middle of the first millennium BC, in all the major civilizations, and in fact, new civilizations are being investigated now, say in Africa, because he didn't actually investigate that himself at the time, that figures arose that seemed to pivot the civilization on an axis in their lives. So these are figures like Lao Tzu and Confucius in China, like the Buddha in India, the Hebrew prophets and the philosophers around the Mediterranean. The Yoruba people in Africa had similar figures. Others, I believe, are coming to light. And what that did particularly was intensify the sense of being an individual, and that the capacity both to embark on personal spiritual quests started to develop, but also the sense that there might be a unity to all things. So for the Hebrew prophets and the ancient philosophers, their sense was key to the emergence of monotheism in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And so I think that that's really important to tell that story, partly because it's of great interest, but partly, as you say, because it gives us a very different sense of who we are, that this process, of course, hasn't stopped. It's unfolding still. And in fact, Barfield, although he very, very well understood the troubles of today and the alienation of a materialist worldview, there was a part of him that knew it was part of a process as well, and so asked, what is trying to be known in our times? And so that invitation is what I was trying to get at, and it's really pleasing that it struck you, because it makes us ask again about our times, I hope.
Yeah. So what it makes me wonder, and you talk about an axial person who does some pivoting, but these people you talked about were huge people in history, and I'm just a little person. I'm not going to be a historical person by any means. And yet, what I'm guessing from what you're saying is, to be an axial person, we can bring it down to the scale of our own individual life and be our own axial person. So, it's like it's bringing the capacity of the capacity of being spiritual right now, in whatever way we make of that. It's like it can bring it down to my life scale. Is that stretching it too much?
No,
No,
not at all. And
not.
it's also saying that how we respond as individuals really matters. That is the theatre in which these things are being played out. Whereas before, in a pre-axial culture, it was much more collective sense of things unfolding. Often in, say, the Neolithic period, focused on a symbolic figure who headed up that culture, a king or a pharaoh. And so in older texts, it's often focused on the king or the pharaoh where the attention gets placed. So you see this in the earlier parts of the Hebrew Bible. It's the king that matters, and the people follow the king. And then you get the prophets starting to emerge and say, wait a minute, is the king taking the place of Yahweh, and so on. So there's tensions being raised there. But now is in a way, and these metaphors are used inside us. We talk about being sovereign ourselves, and we talk about, if you look at things like tarot cards, the images of the king and the queen refer to aspects of our inner life. What was previously external has been internalized, and speaks to us symbolically in that way, and so calls us all to be part of that axial process. Yes. And then a wider manifestation of it appears, as it were, from the inside out rather than from the outside in. So what we do really does count.
Mm. Can you tie that idea somewhat to your chapter where you deal with death? So here's what I'm thinking. I think in order to be an axial person in one's own life, even if it's very internal, I think a lot has to die. I find myself, as I've been thinking through your book, there's some things that I thought I'd finished a long time ago, and they're getting called up again now. Some ideas that I had that either were really sacred to me or not, and there were new things that came up. I think if we're going to be an axial person in our own life, we have to face the death of certain things that have been ingrained in us or that have been special to us. So in some ways, I'm not talking here about our physical death, but maybe the suffering that you were talking about. I think to be an axial person must take some suffering. You think?
Yeah, I think that's true, and I speak cautiously because suffering is always really suffering, and personally, I it's a bit, fearing going where angels fear to tread, and but many figures. Just as you were talking there, Carl Jung came to mind, because of course he many times said that there's no change of consciousness without suffering, because it's about stepping into the unknown, and an existential unknown, where the life that we, more or less thought that we understood doesn't work anymore, and everything is at stake because it's genuine transformation, not just incremental improvement on what we know already. And often it's prompted by crisis, against our will, because the personal will too has to realign with the greater will, and so all these facets mean that, as the wisdom traditions often say, actually, that one of their core offers is actually dying before you die, so that you can at least have a chance to enter this process before really huge crisis faces you, and so maybe ease the suffering in some measure, at least in that way, and call on support, through prayer, through invocation, through ritual, through pilgrimage, all the things which we do to try and
Mhm.
step into a wider life.
Yeah. Yeah. You must see that a lot in your psychotherapy practice, that in essence, that's what you're doing there, is supporting people through those shifts that they need to make. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's complicated because very often therapy, self-help, even a lot of church going in the Christian tradition um, is geared towards living this life better. And of course, there's good reason for that, because it's good to live this life better. But I think that we need to see how we can take that an extra step and realize that actually this life, by which I mean the sort of this worldly, material, secular life with all its benefits, must learn to give way to a wider life as well, because otherwise, well, apart from we're just going to cause ourselves more and more suffering if we don't know how to do that, we won't find satisfaction either, because we are ultimately spiritual creatures, and if we try and satisfy that by material means, we just end up consuming, what looks like almost everything.
Yeah. Well, that's probably why our world's in the mess it's in. It's because we haven't been doing that. Yeah. Which brings me to another um complication, I would say here. I have to read this term because I can't figure out how to give it language exactly. You have an acronym, GCTNLG. Um, good, committed to not letting us go. That's one that I'm really having trouble with, I have to say. And it's in light of what we were just saying. If I'm faced with really sorting through myself and taking these other concepts we've been talking about really seriously, if I want to be my own axial person, and I look at the world outside of me and I see it as being so chaotic and difficult, I find it hard to figure out where this good is that doesn't want to let me go. So I have trouble trying to fit together the belief in something that good and the reality that's outside of me. So help me with that one.
I think that the good can be known in self-evident ways. When you fall in love, you feel that you're entering a life that can be called better and good, and that happens to us. When we have experiences of what's beautiful, we will say that there's a good that lies in the radiance of the beauty. But you're right, there's a lot of suffering in the world, and there's a lot of chaos and even active destruction, of course. We're very conscious of this in Europe right now. And nonetheless, though, I think that it seems to be the case that in times of crisis, for all the ill that's done, at the same time emerges a part of the human spirit that wants to meet the suffering, lessen the ills, and stand for something that's good, even in the rubble. And you see this on a large scale, such as in war. And also, though, I've worked in hospitals, and they stir up human care and concern, and they're very moving places, not just because of the suffering, but because people coming into an intense contact with life at the same time. So the good, it seems to me, must win out in the end, and in fact make its presence known in this mystery through what can be so hard, notwithstanding the fact that sometimes people do get consumed by darkness. So that's what I was feeling. To put it a bit more simply, at the risk of being a bit glib, I think ultimately that the good must win out over the bad, because otherwise we human beings would already have done ourselves in. So, the human psyche, to my mind, is definitely the most powerful thing on earth. And if it wasn't for the fact that it just tipped a bit more towards the good than it did the bad, we would perhaps wouldn't be here already.
Mm. Well, maybe that goes back to being an axial person too. It's so easy to, just looking at the news on TV or on the computer any day. It's so easy to get overwhelmed by that darkness. And it seems like maybe what you're suggesting is if we're going to be an axial person in our own life, in our own small sphere, and if that counts, then the challenge is to be able to see that darkness when it shows up and not be consumed by it, which is, to me, that's a big tall order. But maybe that's where it comes down, is that I need to look at my own little sphere and say, so how do I not get overtaken by that?
And I think also, that part of what these steps are aimed at is to cultivate the possibility of experiencing the world in a different way. The way that time can be experienced in a different way. And it's very widespread observation that people who are suffering are very often either trapped in the past or terrified of the future. And it's only in the present moment that real change occurs. And so cultivating a sense of time that can really elicit the power of the present moment is really important. The virtues include courage. And courage is neither timidity on the one hand nor foolhardiness on the other, but is a capacity to look at what's happening squarely in the face. And so cultivating that is important. These various things, but I think also there's a wisdom, just being more savvy, say, about the media. The 24-hour news cycle can pump horror and terror into your mind all day, every day. And I think it's been exacerbated myself by now the binary substrate of the media world online, because a binary medium tends to split things into a one or a naught, a yes or a no, a good or a bad. And I think that's part of what we're facing now, actually, is not just the division of people, but as if it's a fight between good and ill in a very dualistic sense. And that tends to corrode and hide from view other possibilities, particularly transcendent possibilities, which aren't one or the other, but are something else entirely. So it's serious times. It really is serious times. You're absolutely right about that. But it's partly serious, I think, because we've forgotten so much of who we are. Not because what we are blind to just doesn't exist at all.
Well, I'm looking a little bit at the clock and knowing that we want to save time for our participants to ask you some questions. And I have one last one. I'm just curious, in your having delved into all this, my experience when I'm trying to write is I eat, sleep, and drink whatever it is for quite a while. I'm just totally immersed in it. I'm curious what the experience was for you and how it might have shifted you to have put this book together.
Yeah, there's always a struggle, and you're right. You kind of live it and wait for those moments that say, "Oh, that clicks with that," or they feel quite big revelations at the moment, but really it's just like a paragraph that suddenly works, out of a whole book. But I guess that's, it's not unrelated to what we're talking about, that writing has its mysterious side. And, you find yourself making links that you hadn't realized were there before. And it educates you in the process as well. You receive something in the writing. And so whilst there is the kind of practical decision making, how am I going to hold all these things together? And I've come up with this formula of 7 steps. Once that frame was in place, then I felt a lot of links and even unexpected connections could emerge too. And so that's the satisfaction of writing, you know, as you know, alongside all the effort. And it's you know, it's definitely a marathon writing a book, and you always think, why do I do this? But you know, at the end of the day, it's kind of worth it.
So it sounds like in the end, you were able to come to some of those epiphanies that you probably wouldn't have without having had all the concentration that you put into
Yeah.
it.
And
Yeah,
then people, you know, read it, and like you've said already, it hadn't occurred to me that reading that evolution of consciousness, you know, in fairly compressed form might have the effect that you described. I thought I was just trying to tell the story, you know. So yeah, it's really lovely when that happens.